It's my great pleasure to introduce Sara Tabbert. She's visiting from Fairbanks, and her exhibit Lowlands represents the beautiful landscape of interior Alaska. The exhibit will be up through April 4th, so if you know people who didn't make it tonight, please encourage them to come to the museum. Thank you.
Like Jackie said, I'd like to thank all of you so much for coming and joining me tonight. There are a number of people who traveled from far away to be here for this exhibit, and due to the ferry situation, a number of others who would have liked to have been here from other towns in Southeast. I particularly want to thank the State Museum, the Rasmussen Foundation, who generously gave me a fellowship last year that helped enormously in bringing this show to Juneau. My partner Brandon, who was the curator as well as the mastermind between a lot of the woodworking on the pieces in the exhibit. ECI Alaska Architecture, who sponsored the printing of the brochures, and probably a lot of other people that I'm going to forget about as well. It takes a small army to make something like this come about. Let's see if I can get the... Oh, it's always the technology. There we go. So we had a little bit of a hiccup just about 2 years ago that might have made this cartoon a little bit more accurate. I had a ski injury that I sustained during a cross-country ski excursion with a friend of mine. Leave it to me to have a downhill ski injury on cross-country skis. So I had what's called skier's thumb, and you guys have probably better access to those sorts of opportunities than I do, but I detached a ligament in my thumb, and they had to go back in there and fish it out and hook it back up. And Jackie and everyone at the museum were very accommodating and allowed me to delay my exhibit for a year to let that heal. If you've seen the show, you probably understand that there's an awful lot of handwork involved. And of course it was my right hand. I thought I'd talk to you tonight about a few different things. I'd like to talk about some of the experiences that landed me here tonight and some of the different activities that make up my work as an artist, and a little bit more about some of the work that's in the exhibit. I'm not going to bore you with a long life history, but in a nutshell, I grew up in Fairbanks in the 1970s and 80s. And I can't say that we as a family led a life of high adventure. My parents are here tonight, so perhaps they can corroborate that. But we did spend a lot of time out of doors. And one of the things that I appreciate very much about that time and place was that we had freedom to be outside and alone and somewhat unaccounted for. And I think that that doesn't happen often today, and it's something that I appreciate very much. And it set me up well for my life. Now things haven't changed too much in a lot of fundamental ways. I wasn't someone who grew up thinking that as a young person that I would be an artist. I was interested in a lot of different things, but in the middle of college, I stumbled into a drawing class, and although it wasn't obvious that I would be any good at it for quite a while, I put in the work to acquire the skills that I needed, and with some stops and starts, I graduated with a studio art degree from a college in Iowa, and I went on to graduate school in printmaking at the University of Nebraska. I had the great privilege to study with Karen Kuntz, who is one of the modern masters of contemporary woodcut printmaking. And she was a great influence in many ways, but probably the most important was that I don't know anyone who works as hard and gets as much done as she does. And being her student set a standard for discipline and productivity. One of the other things that happened was that I came out of art school without a real good path forward if I didn't want to be an art professor. I felt like we were well prepared to be art teachers, but how anybody else does it outside of that was a bit of a mystery. And I was one of the oddballs out in my peer group, in that everybody else was definitely on that track and largely have been successful at landing the tenure track position, but it was not something that I wanted to do. These are a couple of wood engravings that I did from that point in time. As I was finishing school, I was also working seasonally in Alaska to help pay for my tuition, and I think that planted the seed for me returning back here. Shortly after graduate school, I had the good fortune to be an artist in residence, more or less for the better part of 2 winters at a small organization in Montana. It's sadly not in operation anymore, but this experience did a couple of things for me. It gave me, as most art residencies do, the time and space to think, but I also met a lot of people who were making it work as independent artists, and people who had made the choice to be where they wanted to be geographically and then figure out the art part afterwards. There was also something very familiar about this strange, scrappy little half-dead mining town, the junk and the characters, and the way that extremely different people managed to be good neighbors. It was a hard place to leave, but I decided at that point that if I wanted to give Alaska a try, the time was now. I figured at that point I was still young enough to make a different decision if it didn't work out. So I loaded up my 700-pound letterpress in the back of a pickup truck and headed north to Fairbanks. I did take a good look at Juneau along the way. I stopped here and did some hard thinking. I'm really taken with this town and this community, but at the time I felt like there was no way that I could have afforded to make it work. And I did have, even though my family had moved away quite a considerable time earlier, I felt like I had a pretty good support system there if I needed help. So along the way, I ran into this guy, and property was acquired, dogs wandered in, structures got underway, and before too long, we were living the dream down in the swamp. We've been making this happen kind of as we've been able to. This is our house. I don't do left and right very well. The snowy one is the house. The summer one is my studio. We've been making all of this happen as we've been able to slowly, and every year things get a little bit more finished and comfortable. The way we've gone about it isn't particularly conventional, but it's a familiar Fairbanks and probably a familiar Alaska story, and it's allowed 2 people to be self-employed with a tolerable threat of financial disaster. We put up the shell of my studio right after the house, and then we kind of promptly ran out of money. And it sat that way for a number of years, and eventually I was able to borrow the money to pay Brandon, who is a contractor, carpenter, also in the audience tonight, to finish it so that I could move in and start using it as an art studio. We have a running joke where Brandon likes to tell me about all the independent carpenters and woodworkers he knows whose wives have good jobs with benefits. And I can turn that one back around. I'm not sure having 2 sole proprietors in one household is a course I'd recommend to others, but we're both still playing that game of chicken and nobody's blinked yet. I think we're both willing to sacrifice what we have to do our work on our own terms. Before we get to talking about the work in the exhibit, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the ways I spend my time as an artist. This includes some teaching work, some residencies, and some larger commission projects. One of my first experiences as a quote-unquote professional was in an art residency, the one I showed you in Montana. And I think that has helped maintain the idea of seeking out art residencies as an important part of what I do. My interest in the outdoors made the ones that are offered through the National Park Service a good choice. And the first one of those that I had the opportunity to participate in was in Denali. In this park, which is also the most familiar national park to me, I wandered far and wide as an artist in residence, but I was drawn back again and again to the power of the glacial fed rivers. And I spent a lot of time thinking about trying to visually represent the sound of the unseen rocks being moved by that force of water. On Isle Royal, island in the middle of Lake Superior, that the whole thing is a national park, it was kind of a fantasy of an artist summer camp. No bears. That was nice. It was a place where I could really sink into the quiet and look at the details of the landscape. One thing that's common in my work is that even in the grandest places, I'm always pulled back to the elements of the lesser details. In the late fall of 2014, I spent a month as an artist in residence in Zion National Park, which was a completely new environment and a park with a very, very different level of visitation than any national park that I'd been in before. It really gave me some insight into the complexity of the mandate that Park Service has to balance the idea of access as well as protection of the resource. And I'd like to stop here just for a second and talk a little bit about these carved panel pieces. I had some questions tonight about how I go about making them. The carved wood panels, I think, are a pretty direct extension of the work that I do to make the prints. It's the same tools, it's the same ways of carving, except the main difference in a lot of ways is that they're not printed. The boards all begin black. I sketch out imagery roughly with a white pencil, but most of the drawing is really done with carving tools as I'm working. I add color later, and then the pieces are finished with a water-based finish, and if I'm adding color to them, it's with a kind of a light-bodied acrylic paint. Most printmakers that I know take side trips into book arts or paper making, but for me, it seems to be all about learning more things that I can do with wood. This is, again, from Zion, and this is a piece that's now in the collection of their museum that the park has. In 2016, I was able to go back to Denali Park again as a winter resident. They have 2 separate residencies that they offer. Some of you might recognize this cabin. It's the one at Savage. If you spend time in Denali in the summer, it's kind of a living history interpretive cabin. So it was funny to be there when it was so quiet and then to think about all of the tour buses that would be coming through in the summertime. I did a lot of skiing, which we can also call research if we want to. I have a unique perspective on Denali Park from many different angles. I spent quite a number of years as a staff member at a lodge in Kantishna. I've been an artist in the summer and the winter. I participate pretty much annually in a recurring residency that's offered through Holland America at a lodge near the park entrance. Many different parts of my life have that place as a thread that runs through it. And then most recently, I was pretty close to where we are now. I was an artist in residence on the Chilkoot Trail last summer. And this is a unique residency in many ways. One is that you get to bring a friend, and my friend Amanda served the role as my artist support person. I felt like she should have a yellow vest with a handle on it that I could grab onto, but we didn't go quite that far. It's a somewhat unique residency in other ways in that it's a joint offering between the National Park Service and Parks Canada, so a real cooperative model. We had a great 2 weeks out on the trail, and right now I'm in the process of turning my sketches into finished pieces for a show in Anchorage in April. I've been a little bit busy getting ready for some other show that you might have heard about. Amanda wouldn't necessarily consider herself an artist, but she did engage in some artist-like activities. We were told that we could bring anything we wanted on the trail except for a piano. And so she decided that she needed to bring a piano and had a good time setting up some delightful images that play with scale in the landscape, if we want to talk about it in an art-like way. I'm not going to jinx myself by talking about it, but I put in an application for another park in a very different part of the country, and we'll see what comes of that. I tend to choose one place and then just kind of hammer away at it until I'm too frustrated or something comes through. Other residencies that I've done have taken me to Dawson City, a wonderful print studio in Buenos Aires, to Italy, and in 2016, I spent an incredible 2 months at a print studio in Cleveland through a residency that was offered for a number of years by the Rasmussen Foundation. And in 2017, back to Montana through an environmental and humanities center run by the University of Utah. I'd also like to say it would be a good time to mention that a number of these excursions were supported by grants from the Alaska State Council on the Arts. Their career opportunity grants are modest, but they often cover the cost of travel, which can often be the barrier to entry for artists from Alaska for a lot of these things. So if we need to fight for them again, let's do it. I find traveling with the intent to make art a very different and deeper way of understanding a place than just being a tourist. And as an artist who's somewhat geographically isolated, I think it's critical for meeting people and seeing new things. So another aspect of my work that, as an artist, that both takes me traveling but also connects me to communities in a different way is through the Artists in the Schools program, and here we're making some prints in Kodiak. I've conducted residencies with public school students all over the state, from Southeast to the Seward Peninsula to the Aleutians and the Pribilofs. My rule has always been, if they call me and I have time to go, if I can fit it into my schedule, I'll go. I'm not going to ask too many questions. And there have been some times where I've said yes and then broken out the map to figure out where it was that I'm going. These experiences have taught me more about Alaska than anything I've ever done. I'll be honest, it's a complex feat of logistics for the artist, and it requires being good at a lot of different things, and I probably work harder during these projects than anything else that I do. Of all of the things that went wrong politically for artists last summer, being told in such a blatant way that this part of my work didn't matter left me a little bit too angry to engage right now, but hopefully we won't have to repeat the experience and I'll be back at it before too long. The work with students has taught me about culture and the complexity and richness of rural Alaska. I get to see the idea of place through the eyes of different young people. Old and new technology. And I've learned a bit of what it is like to be a student in improbable places, like a school of 12 on a largely abandoned military community out in the middle of the ocean. I've had the pleasure of working at schools that I attended myself in Fairbanks. And I've helped students of all ages turn their ideas into beautiful projects for themselves, as well as others that will remain as part of their schools long after they are gone. As someone who doesn't have kids, it's made me a better informed and much more engaged community member around education and our schools. So these teaching adventures also find their way into my own work. The education definitely doesn't flow only in one direction. So sometimes I have the opportunity to talk to students at the university in Fairbanks about my career, and understandably, they're often very interested in how the numbers work. And I usually lay it out for them as different sets of income-producing activities. There are residencies, which generally lead to gallery-scale projects and work that goes out into the world that way. There's paid contract teaching through Artists in the Schools and other workshops. There's some grants and also public art projects. I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to work on a far larger scale than I ever would have predicted. As somebody who made work for a long time that was only measured in inches, it's been really fun to scale up and make some things that are measured in feet. This is the one place where our two household businesses can really join forces. Everything that I can't do, Brandon can, and these bigger pieces are a true logistical collaboration. I'm really lucky to have someone that I trust completely for fabrication and installation, as I think this is often a really difficult part for artists to work out, in no small part on the financial end. Also, this way we're able to retain nearly all of the budget between the two of us, which is a huge advantage. This piece is at Pathways Junior Senior High in Palmer. This one is at the Kenai Peninsula College in Soldotna. And most recently, this is a series of panels that I completed last year for the new engineering building at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Even on these larger pieces, I'm using the exact same processes that you saw in the work in the show. It's the same tools, the same hand carving, the same painting. There are probably more practical ways to make large pieces, but I think you lose something once the handwork goes out of it. And there's the finished set of panels. So to kind of wrap things up, I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically about the work that's in this show. I've been talking a lot tonight about places and their importance in my work, and my home is where I spend the bulk of my time, and I thought that it deserved some attention. People often talk about the advice to writers to write what they know. I've been looking at this land for a long time, probably since the days that my school bus took me past the land we now own on my way to school. Our large piece of property contains a creek, black and white spruce, larch, a few struggling birch trees, berries, wildflowers, and a surprising variety of wildlife. It's incredibly beautiful. We have space for dogs and trails for miles right out the door. I count any stretch of days when I don't have to get in my car and go anywhere and can just be there, the best spent time. It's also a tough place. I find sometimes people want to put words into my mouth about my work, and they want to ascribe a kind of peaceful or more spiritual sensibility to my relationship to this place. I guess I'd argue that really it's more of a fight. We have a somewhat antagonistic relationship, with the natural world as the antagonist and me always coming back wanting to be friends. Maybe it's an abusive relationship. The permafrost swallows the driveway. The foundations of the buildings are always shifting. The trees fall on things. The cold breaks stuff. We put up a fence to keep dogs from bothering nature, and the nature sends porcupines in to quill the dogs or a muskrat to slice open one's face. This winter, the snowshoe hares are busy chewing holes in the fence. The wasps build nests in the ground for us to step on. The overflow changes the conditions of trails constantly, and you can be surprised by a good soaking at 20 below. There's forest fires to worry about. It freezes in July and kills your tomatoes, and then it freezes again in August and kills them again. It's not super kind and gentle, but I'm happy to keep trying. The problem in the relationship is likely mine. There are, and of course always have been, people out there. Some of us have been better to the land than others. In the early 1900s, the hills around the valley that I live in were stripped of trees. Miners dug up the creeks, and there was even a narrow gauge railroad that ran through the valley. There are a few signs of this still, but not too much is left. Today, it's an assortment of people doing different things, some treating the land well, some badly, and it's never all one thing or the other. I have to confess that I have great affection for the quirks of how people live, our junk, our strangely built houses, the lack of pretension. In my statement, I talk about how people end up living there by choice and also by circumstance, and I think both of these things are true for us. I'm definitely not apart from the trailers and the shipping containers and the falling down cabins. In many ways, the ability to have what many would consider a low standard of living has also been the thing that's allowed me to be an artist in an improbable place. Brandon and I have put the bulk of our property into conservation easements, hoping to leave some things alone for the future, but also perhaps to pay a little debt for what we've disturbed. I guess one thing that gives me hope about how we affect the natural world is looking at how much things in parts of my valley that have been left alone for time to repair have done so, even after so much impact. It'll never be perfect, but I guess I want my work to encourage us all to care a little bit more about what my friend Cheryl Riley calls the lesser landscapes, the places that are less pristine and a little bit harder to love. Dramatic beauty gets attention and hopefully protection, but the ecology and connections that exist in places that are easily trashed or bulldozed are just as important. I've also been thinking a lot about materials and what we use to make our work. There's this idea sometimes with artists that we deserve anything that we feel we want if our ideas call for it. I'm not sure that I agree, and I think that's part of what drove some of these three-dimensional pieces in the exhibit. Could I say what I want to say with nothing more than a tree from my backyard, of which there are plenty? Does it always have to be on expensive paper from a faraway country? Can my work be smaller and say what it needs to say? Has any artist anywhere ever heard, have you thought about making that smaller? The art world often fetishizes size and scale and aggressiveness, and to some extent, it's all a very consumptive process. Does my work deserve what it uses? And before anybody gives me a lecture about self-confidence, don't worry, I'm thinking the same thing about everybody else's work as well. Can I work in ways that pack up better, that ship more efficiently? Can I use everything without waste? I'm definitely an object maker and will always be wanting to tell stories that run through things, and figuring out how to make these things in the best way is really important. There's a lot of other things I could talk about tonight, but we have things to do, and I really appreciate you spending your time here tonight. And I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity to show in what I think is the most beautiful space in the state. Thank you very much. It's okay, you don't have to.
When do we get to look inside the boxes?
Well, in this context, that is a little bit difficult to pull off. I think you might have to come to my studio when I have some more done and take a look inside. I apologize, but no.
It just doesn't sound very loud.
Okay.
Wait.
The microphone.
Do you apply for numerous artists in residence opportunities at one time, or do you focus on where you really want to go and apply for individual places?
I think I've been more focused just because it makes me a little bit crazy trying to think about the possibility, should I be so lucky that, I can only afford time and logistics-wise to do so much running around in a year. So I'll sort of pick one and then focus on that, one or two, and when when and if that comes through, then I'll move on to something else. I know there are a lot of artists who are able to maybe be a little bit more footloose, and they're sending out applications all over the place. And sometimes I've had friends who basically live at artist residencies. They go from one place to another, and that's a pretty cool lifestyle if that works for you.
I'm interested to hear more about your image making process. That how do you distill your sketches into being a finished piece?
From a sketch to a carved wood piece? It's pretty straightforward. I usually have a combination of preliminary drawings and sometimes some photographs that I'm looking at the same time, and then I do a little bit of general layout on the blocks, and then a lot of the drawing is just done as I'm carving with the tools. I don't do a whole lot of detailed planning, and it leaves me the opportunity to make changes as I inevitably screw something up, because it's pretty hard to go backwards in that process. So I don't want to have my ideas too locked in. When something goes flying out, then I can make some adjustments.
I'm curious, I'm not an expert in printmaking, but when you migrated from the 700-pound press to wood blocks, and what led to that?
Well, I'm still pretty actively working as a printmaker. So I have that press that I showed you the picture of. I've also got an etching press, the more traditional one with the big flywheel. So I'm definitely still doing both, but the transition from work on paper to also doing work on wood was pretty simple. I was doing a project where I needed to practice using some tools that I hadn't used in a while. I took a board, I painted it black just to practice for a print that I was working on. And at some point along the way, I looked at the carving and I thought, I don't know, maybe I might like this more than the print itself. And I'm sure I am not unique among printmakers, where sometimes you look at the finished product and the thing that got you there, and the plate or the block or the stone is actually more effective than what came off of it. But I think for me, there's definitely a relationship between the two, and I would never want to give up making prints. That's the thing that I always cycle back through.
Where do you see the future of art going? I mean, it's a big question, but I graduated from UAF, and then I was doing research in climate change, and what really motivated me to become a climate activist was an art show that I went, and art is such a universal language, and it can speak the heart language, not the head language.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see how we can engage more artists to speak, to help with the climate crisis, and also, and at least under this administration, with all the budget cuts, it really concerns me for people to become more creative.
I think you answered your question well, and this might be a lazy response, but I agree with what you say. I would also I think it's important to have artists who engage with political issues. I also think it's important that it isn't a mandate that's placed upon all artists that their work has to be political. And I've done a lot of thinking about that myself, and done some reading and listening to things. And I heard something that gave me some relief, because there are times when I think I really need to try and push my art in this direction that is a bit more political, but it's not, for me personally, it's not a natural fit. And a Canadian art historian, whose name will escape me now, as names always do, was talking about how it's it's equally effective to be a politically engaged person as well, in addition to, in contrast perhaps to being making art that's politically engaged. Like, you can do just as much good if you're doing that work in your life. Your artwork doesn't necessarily have to. But if it is something that that you feel committed to, and the work that you make in that direction is genuine, I think it's really important, and it can be very, very powerful. As you have said, it's something that pushed you in the way that you're going now. So I think that's great.
Thank you.
You, I heard you on your interview this afternoon, and you said you were getting into three-dimensional sculpture but you sounded a little tentative about it, and I just wonder if you could talk about that transition a little bit.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yeah,
you
I'm
know,
sure it
it's a lot more complicated than making flat pieces. Yeah, I'm definitely pursuing that, and I think this show is the beginning point of something that will continue. It's been exciting to make some things that you can look at from more than one direction, and that can say something on the inside and on the outside. And I just think there's a lot of new territory. I have a friend in Fairbanks who has told me for years, we're gonna make you into a sculptor yet. We're gonna make you into a sculptor yet. So I think this might be coming to fruition.
How would you describe your relationship with your artwork?
we got the big ones here. I would say that, unlike my relationship with the natural world, it's not an abusive relationship. We get along pretty well. It's something I think, even though I said that I was not someone who knew from early on that I wanted to be an artist, I've always been someone who's made things, and that's taken a lot of different forms. And at the moment, and probably for the future, this is the way, that's where that energy will be channeled. I'm lucky in that I'm never lacking for ideas going into the studio. I know some artists struggle in that way. There's always more work that I want to do than I have time for, and I'm really grateful for that that sort of lack of angst in making the work itself. I very, very much enjoy what I do, and I'm also very aware of the fact that there are a lot of people in the world who are probably far more talented than I am, who just by circumstance will probably never have the opportunity to spend any time in creative activity. And I have no reason to ever feel sorry for myself if I'm frustrated by my work. It's just, it's a great way to be able to spend my time. Really lucky.
As you've moved around the country, have you experimented with different types of woods or come to know different woods in their uses?
I haven't so much yet, but I would like to. I'm really still in the learning process of exploring all of that. Not this coming summer, but the following summer. I just found out recently I've been accepted as a fellow for a residency program at a place called the Center for Art and Wood in Philadelphia, and I think that will be a great opportunity in many different levels, but that's something that I'm thinking about, exploring what is available in that very, very different part of the world. I also had this realization as I was working on it. I was thinking, I can't just go and cut down a tree. How am I going to get my trees? We have access to some things in Alaska that are much simpler than other parts of the country. Okay. Anybody else? If you're good, I'm good.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much.